Britain waged two wars against China to force them to buy drugs, not metaphorically. Literally. The British Empire grew opium in India, smuggled it into China, addicted millions of Chinese citizens, and when China tried to stop it, Britain sent warships, killed thousands, and forced China to pay for the privilege of being invaded. Then they took Hong Kong and held it for 156 years. This isn't ancient history shrouded in mystery. This is documented imperial drug dealing at gunpoint, and it's one of the clearest examples of how empires don't create wealth, they extract it. By 1839, Britain faced a problem that would sound absurd if it weren't so brutal in execution. China had things Britain wanted: tea, silk, porcelain, but Britain had nothing China wanted in return. The Chinese didn't want British wool, didn't want British manufactured goods, didn't care about British anything. So Britain had to pay in silver, tons of it. Silver flowing out of Britain into China, year after year, creating a massive trade deficit that threatened Britain's silver reserves. The solution the British came up with wasn't innovation or creating better products. It was drugs, opium. Grown in British-controlled India, processed into smokable form, and smuggled into China in violation of Chinese law. The drug trade was so successful that by 1839, opium sales to China paid for the entire British tea trade. Not part of it, all of it. The trade deficit disappeared. Better yet for Britain, silver stopped flowing to China and started flowing out because Chinese citizens were now spending their silver on opium. Millions became addicted. Families destroyed. Productivity collapsed. Silver drained from the Chinese economy, and Britain called this free trade. Here's how the economics actually worked. The British East India Company, a corporation that functioned as a state, complete with its own 260,000-man army, grew opium on plantations in India. They auctioned it to British merchants, who smuggled it into China through a network of dealers and corrupt officials. By the 1830s, they were importing over 30,000 chests of opium annually into China. Each chest contained about 140 pounds of opium. That's over 4 million pounds of drugs being smuggled into a country where it was illegal, creating an estimated 12 million addicts by 1840. The Qing dynasty watched their society deteriorate and their silver reserves disappear. In 1839, the Daeguang Emperor decided enough was enough and sent Lin Zexu, a special imperial commissioner, to Canton to end the opium trade. Lin didn't mess around. He arrested Chinese smugglers involved in the trade. Then he blockaded the British merchants in their warehouses and forced them to hand over their opium stocks, over 20,000 chests, about 1,400 tons of opium. Lin's men mixed it with lime and salt and dumped it into the sea, destroying it all. He then wrote a letter to Queen Victoria asking if Britain would tolerate opium being sold to British citizens, pointing out that China had the right to protect its people from drugs that Britain itself had banned. The letter was never answered. Instead, Britain went to war. The British government's justification was remarkable in its cynicism. Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston argued that the destroyed opium should be considered property, not contraband, and that China owed reparations for destroying it. He consulted with William Jardine, literally one of the biggest opium smugglers, whose company Jardine Matheson leased ships to the Royal Navy for the invasion, before drafting the demands. The official position was that Britain was fighting for free trade and diplomatic equality. The real position, stated in Parliament, was that they needed to correct China's balance of payments deficit. Translation: China wasn't buying enough from us, so we're going to make them buy drugs at gunpoint. In June 1840, 16 British warships arrived at Guangzhou. Many were leased from Jardine Matheson, the primary opium producer. British forces had steamships, modern artillery, and professional marines. Chinese forces had wooden junks, outdated cannons, and muskets that hadn't been upgraded in a century. It wasn't a war, it was a slaughter. British ships bombarded Chinese forts, captured cities, and sailed up rivers cutting off supply lines. Chinese officers committed suicide when they couldn't repel the invasion. By 1842, British forces captured Nanjing, and the Qing dynasty had no choice but to negotiate. The Treaty of Nanking, signed August 29, 1842, was what the Chinese would later call the first of the unequal treaties. Treaties signed at gunpoint where one side dictates all terms. China had to pay Britain 21 million silver dollars in reparations. 6 million immediately, the rest in installments. This wasn't reparations for starting the war. This was payment for the destroyed opium. China had to pay Britain for the drugs China had confiscated. China had to open 5 treaty ports to British trade: Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningpo, and Shanghai. British merchants could now trade with whomever they wanted, bypassing Chinese regulations. China had to grant Britain most favored nation status and extraterritoriality, meaning British citizens in China were exempt from Chinese law. They could only be tried in British courts, even for crimes committed on Chinese soil. And China had to cede Hong Kong Island to Britain in perpetuity. Forever. The treaty specifically used the Chinese phrase Changyue, perpetuity. Britain took a strategically valuable island as a permanent colony because China tried to stop drug smuggling. When the Qing commissioner reviewed the terms, he paused and said, "Is that all?" He expected worse. That's how thoroughly China had been defeated, but Britain wasn't satisfied. The Treaty of Nanking didn't explicitly legalize opium. Palmerston couldn't put that in writing because it would confirm to his domestic critics that Britain had literally gone to war to sell drugs. So in 1856, Britain found another excuse to restart hostilities. A Chinese-owned ship that had been briefly registered in Hong Kong, the Arrow, was boarded by Chinese authorities for suspected piracy. The British claimed this was an insult to the British flag, even though the ship's registration had expired. Britain demanded an apology, China refused, and the Second Opium War began. This time France joined in after a French missionary was executed. The United States and Russia also got involved, wanting their own concessions. The Second War was even more brutal than the first. In 1860, British and French forces marched to Beijing, looted and burned the old Summer Palace, destroying priceless cultural treasures, and occupied the Forbidden City. The Qing Emperor fled to Manchuria. The resulting Treaty of Tientsin in 1858 and Convention of Beijing in 1860 forced China to legalize the opium trade, open 11 more ports, allow foreign diplomats to reside in Beijing, pay another 8 million taels in reparations to Britain and France, cede the Kowloon Peninsula to Britain, expanding Hong Kong, grant Christians the right to own property and evangelize throughout China, and open the entire interior of China to foreign travel. Russia took advantage of China's weakness to seize parts of outer Manchuria. China had been carved up by foreign powers, all because they tried to stop drug smuggling. The pattern here is pure empire extraction economics. Britain wasn't trading value for value. They were using military force to impose a trade relationship that benefited only Britain. The opium itself was grown in colonized India, another extraction economy where Britain controlled production and forced cultivation of cash crops instead of food. Indian farmers grew opium for British profits while experiencing periodic famines. That opium was then smuggled into China, creating an entire economy built on addiction and social destruction. When China tried to stop it, Britain didn't negotiate or find alternative products to trade. They invaded, killed, stole territory, and forced China to pay for their own invasion. The silver that flowed out of China went to British merchants and the British East India Company. The tea, silk, and porcelain that Britain wanted now came with no silver cost. They paid for it with opium profits. It was a closed loop of extraction. Force India to grow opium, force China to buy opium, use opium profits to buy Chinese goods, use military force to maintain the system. The wealth that accumulated in London came directly from addiction in China and colonization in India. This is identical to how Rome extracted wealth from Egypt through grain tribute, how Spain extracted silver from Potosi through enslaved indigenous labor, how Belgium extracted rubber from Congo through mass murder. Empires in decline don't create wealth, they extract it. And they use military force to maintain extraction systems, even when those systems are obviously destroying the societies being exploited. The Opium Wars marked the beginning of what China calls the Century of Humiliation, roughly 1839 to 1949, when foreign powers controlled Chinese ports, Chinese trade, Chinese territory, and Chinese sovereignty. The psychological and economic impact was so profound that Chinese students still learn about the Opium Wars as the cautionary tale of what happens when a nation becomes weak and vulnerable to foreign powers. Hong Kong remained under British control until 1997, 156 years, because Britain forced China to accept drug smuggling at gunpoint. The easy narrative is that Britain was more technologically advanced and therefore won. That's not wrong, but it obscures the real mechanism. Britain won because they were willing to use industrial-scale violence to maintain a drug trade that was illegal in their own country. They banned opium use in Britain but forced it on China. They called it free trade, but it was only free in one direction. British merchants were free to sell drugs. Chinese authorities weren't free to enforce their own laws. That's not trade. That's imperial extraction backed by military force. The modern parallel isn't hard to see. When powerful nations want access to resources or markets, they don't ask politely and accept no for an answer. They find justifications, spreading democracy, fighting terrorism, protecting human rights, maintaining free trade, and they use economic or military pressure to get what they want. The vocabulary changes, but the mechanism doesn't. Control the rules, control the markets, control the military power, extract the wealth. The Opium Wars weren't ancient history. They were a blueprint for how empires operate when they prioritize extraction over creation, when they value profit over human cost, and when they have the military power to enforce systems that benefit themselves at the expense of everyone else. This is the empire economy, where we decode the systems that concentrate wealth and power. Britain didn't build prosperity through opium. They transferred it from Chinese families to British merchants, from Chinese society to British coffers, from Chinese sovereignty to British territory. And they did it with warships, forced treaties, and 156 years of colonial control. That's not trade. That's theft. Subscribe to see more patterns of imperial extraction that operate in plain sight but are rarely explained honestly.